Today we will continue our exploration of the history of public education by looking at the movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for a more inclusive, empowering, and socially just educational system. To help us do that, we're excited and we're honored to be joined by Dr. Fanny Rushing. She is currently a history professor at Benedictine University in Lisle, Illinois. From 1962 to 1966, she was field secretary for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she was a teacher in the Freedom Schools at that time. Dr. Fanny Rushing, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. I want to just give you a chance to say a few words about anything else that's important for us to know about who you are and the work that you've done for education and for social justice, especially during that period in the 1950s to 70s.
The one thing I'd like to amend is that certainly one of the things that was of interest to me, most interest to me while I was working for SNCC, was the whole issue of freedom schools and education. And actually, a small group of us pioneered, if you will, in creating the first residential freedom school that SNCC had. And we had that here in Chicago. The idea of the residential freedom school was to bring together young people from the South and young people from the North to see what their experiences were around segregation and discrimination. It was a time in which SNCC was exploring, as was much of the nation, this question of whether or not racism existed in both the North and the South. Was it the same? Was it different? How did you attack it? And we thought one of the best ways to find that out was to allow young people to come together and talk about their common experiences or their experiences around segregation and discrimination. We wanted, and we did, have a residential freedom school where for the first 6 weeks the students were here in Chicago, and for the second 6 weeks, this was a summer program, they were to be in Cordele, Georgia, to experience, to talk about what they saw in each setting, and then to come back together and try and figure out what they had learned over the summer. We had some really interesting experiences in both places, and certainly was a big part of, I think, for all of us that worked on the program, and there were four of us, Judy Richardson, John Love, Sharon, her name at that time was Sharon Jackson. She became Amina Rahman, and myself, with the off and on assistance of Charlie Cobb, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, people who were working in other parts of SNCC's program, but were interested in both seeing what we were doing in the residential freedom school, also what impact the civil rights movement was having on the young people that we worked with. So I think that's real important because the freedom school model has grown so tremendously over the last 30 years. But I think what we did in Chicago over that particular summer was an important contribution to the work of the freedom schools. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, you said that was the very first residential freedom school. Did that become a model that was taken up in other places?
Certainly, the schools that Marian Wright Edelman uses now the summer ones are residential freedom schools. I don't know whether or not ours served as a model or not. It was the only time that SNCC ever did it. So I can't really say. I just know that there are in different places now residential freedom schools. Whether or not those people knew anything about the one we hosted, I don't know.
Can you say a little bit more about what the experience of the Freedom Schools was like and how it differed, especially at that time, from what students would be getting in a traditional public school?
Well, still, both then and now, I think there is a real difference between what students get in a traditional public school and what, at least in the SNCC Freedom Schools. The SNCC Freedom Schools were very much associated with and part of the civil rights movement. I mean, they grew specifically the SNCC Freedom Schools because there had been freedom schools before SNCC. As a matter of fact, Noel Day out in Boston had been experimenting before SNCC with this idea of a freedom school or a different way of learning for inner city youth. So SNCC did not originate the idea of a freedom school, but the freedom schools that SNCC did create grew very specifically out of the voter registration movement in the South, so that initially the schools were designed to help people pass the literacy test, to educate people about voting not just as part of the political process, but as part of the process of liberation. The SNCC Freedom Schools always maintained that connection between education for liberation. It was not ever a matter of simply learning one's ABCs or mathematics. It was very much a question of how do we use education to liberate ourselves? What do we need to know to bring about the kind of society that we want? And of course, based on SNCC's philosophy that every single individual has the ability to understand his or her own life circumstances and to make changes in the direction that they want to make them, was at the very root of the learning process. So it was never a matter of providing people with answers, but allowing people to find the answer that they needed to resolve a particular problem. And so that is certainly not what goes on in the public schools. They were never intended to do that, and of course they do not. And now the Freedom School model has multiplied 10 times over, but from what I have seen, many of the things that are identified as freedom schools today are very different than this model that SNCC used, because it's clear that the freedom school can simply be an alternative pedagogy. But that was never the case with SNCC. It wasn't just a different way of putting the ABCs together. There was a very different purpose, and because there was a very different purpose, there was also a very different way of operating for students inside the freedom school. Many of the ones that exist today do not have anything to do with the whole question of liberation, of social justice, but it is just an alternative way of covering material that is part of the standard curriculum.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate the way you frame that. So you're comparing traditional ways of teaching and learning and traditional purposes, which were much more about sorting and winners and losers and getting the best job, to maybe an alternative approach to how material is taught. And then on the other end of the continuum is really putting the issue of liberation at the center of the purpose of education, and then encouraging that deep critical thought as a central part of what the mission is.
Yeah, it's liberation for the South, but it is also liberation for the group. It is liberation that has at its core a quest for equality, a quest for social justice. And it is not just the mastery of a given set of text.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful framing. I'm wondering if we can just take a bit of a step back and if you can just sketch out at a very big picture level an overview of the types of movements that were fighting for a more empowering and liberating educational system throughout that period. So the freedom schools are one strand of that. Just so we have the big picture, what were some of the other big things that were happening from the 50s to the 70s?
Of course, the big thing was after Brown versus the Board of Education was very much this question of equal access to education through integration of the schools and through busing. I mean, that was certainly busing very much in the North and integration in the South. And so the movements really began to focus on the desegregation of schools more than what was going to be going on after desegregation or after people had equal access. There was not as much of a concern about what the implications of desegregation or busing would be. Given the struggle around education and integration, the whole component of education became almost lost. And it was really just a question of equal access, that people had a right to go to school, but in that case, not a concern so much about curriculum. And I would say until the middle latter part of the 60s, that was the main thrust around education.
And then maybe in the mid to late 60s, we saw a lot more of the liberation movements putting forward much more of a paradigm you're talking about in terms of a liberatory educational paradigm, not just about inclusion, but about what the purpose was and the content. We've talked about SNCC's freedom schools. Can you talk about other models either within the Black liberation movement, like the Panther schools, or how that then was taken up by the Chicano movement, feminist movements, just how that spread?
The Panther model, and certainly the Institute for Positive Education here in Chicago, one of the things that moved to the forefront was to begin to dismiss questions of integration and to focus exclusively on curriculum and culture, so that the schools were basically set up to be Afrocentric, to reinforce. Even in the Panther schools, the basis was still a nationalist, a liberation thrust, but primarily the objective was to root the student or the pupil in a cultural milieu that was conducive to reinforcing a positive image of the self. And in all of the Afrocentric schools, in the nationalist schools, it was very much this question of if one has a positive image of the self, everything else will fall into place. And again, it had not reached the stage where many of these schools are now, where it's almost a misnomer to call them freedom schools, because they really are not. They are just looking at curriculum differently. Certainly with the Latin American movements, a lot of emphasis on the kind of critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire, I would say, was a tremendous influence in a lot of the solidarity movements in the United States around Latin America, which certainly in the 70s and 80s were extremely, extremely strong. And therefore, the model as proposed by Freire for how you do critical education became almost the dominant paradigm. I mean, and I don't know that people necessarily Sometimes they were referred to as freedom schools, but really it was much more a model of, again, critical pedagogy, which was not necessarily tied directly to social movements. They certainly had a vision of a better future. They had a vision of change in the future, but unlike the SNCC Freedom Schools, where people were learning how to pass the literacy test, but they were also going down to the courthouse to engage the registrar in their own learning about why they had the right to vote. It may seem as though the difference I'm making is insignificant, but I do think that it very much integrated resistance, liberation, social action, and education in a way that many other schools did not.
Oh, that's critical. Absolutely critical distinction you're making. I really appreciate that. Let me ask you to say just a word about any of the issues that were coming up in the late 60s, 70s around community control. You know, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, where there were sort of clashes over who was going to control the schools. Anything you might want to comment about that?
Well, of course, in Chicago, the whole issue of schools has been one of the most pressing issues in the black struggle. In many other places, there have been different issues, but the issue in Chicago was consistent from the time of the first wave of the Great Migration. And initially, the way it was handled was by saying, okay, you can have, the black community could have 2 or 3 schools that were to be their schools, and there really wasn't anyone else in them because the schools were tied to the neighborhood school system, where you had to go to the school that was in your neighborhood. There was no such thing at the time as the permissive transfer or anything other than if you lived at a certain address, you went to the school in that neighborhood. Once those schools were deeded out, if you will, as being the black school, and there were like 2 or 3 at first, and then, of course, as the black community just mushroomed in size in the 50s, 60s, more and more schools became dedicated as black schools. And the superintendent of schools in Chicago, Benjamin Willis, was a man who was an avowed racist. He did not make any apologies for the fact that he believed that the schools should remain segregated. They should remain tied to the neighborhood where you lived. The problem was that if you were in an all-black school, you were not going to get books, you were not going to get teachers who were qualified, and that does not mean that there were not any qualified teachers in these schools. Some of them were very fine teachers and very, very committed to the young people that they were there to serve. But generally speaking, their hands were tied because they were not going to be given the books, they were not going to be given the equipment, they were not going to be provided with the kinds of resources that they needed to teach for the 20th century. And so as the schools began to grow larger inside and white flight to the suburbs increased, one of the ramifications of that was that you had white schools where the classroom size was maybe 20 or 25. And yet on the south and west sides of the city, it was not uncommon to have 100 kids in a room. And at the time, there were not teachers' aides. There was just a teacher trying to minister to that size class, which, of course, they couldn't do. And then all of the non-specifically education issues that began to increase such as unemployment, social disintegration in the community, began to make the schools not sites of education, but just repositories for keeping people off the street during the day, but not much more than that. And as the class sizes continued to grow larger, the demand was, well, let's take the pressure off of the schools on the west and south side. Let us use schools on the north side where the class size is much smaller and the resources are there. Willis's response to that was to buy trailers and to start sending kids to school in these trailers. Well, of course, the trailers were basically box cars with no windows, and children went to school a half day in these trailers that began to dot the community on the west and south side, ultimately beginning a movement around getting rid of Willis and quality education, which was often focused just on integration, but really it was a movement for better schools for the west and south side of the city. And ultimately, the struggle ended in two major school boycotts in Chicago. 250,000 kids were organized by the CCCO, Coordinating Council of Community Organizations, but largely put forward by Chicago Area Friends of SNCC, the northern component of the SNCC movement in the South. And, of course, freedom schools were used when these 250,000 kids, it's a lot of kids, walked out of school. And ultimately, Benjamin Willis was removed. The first black superintendent of schools, Ruth Love, was brought in. And from that came the movement around local school councils, a belief that the parents had a right to be involved in the education of their children. And so the demand was for local school councils in all of the neighborhoods. The local school councils did not work out as well as they might have for a variety of reasons, and pretty much have become just lame ducks now. Some of them still exist, but they are far different from what the intent was when people began to talk about community control of schools. One of the things that is now beginning to happen is a similar demand for community control of schools is resulting in increasing demands for an elected, not an appointed school board. And so one can really trace the history of the struggle for public education in Chicago from the 1960s through today, and the anger that has surfaced around Rahm Emanuel and the effort to privatize education, raising the question of really what is the future of public education in Chicago and nationally. It seems as though that these efforts toward privatization, the effort toward having corporations write the curriculum and essentially train the workers that they will need for their particular sphere of the economy, seems to be the 21st century model. And 19th and 20th century notions about the right and the need for public education seems to be disappearing.
Wow, you went exactly where I wanted to go, which was what connections you're seeing between sort of the educational history we've been talking about and then the battles that are raging today over the future of education. And I think the situation with Rahm Emanuel is a great example. I think I heard wasn't there just a non-binding vote around
yes, a non-binding referendum
right,
on the part of the people that an elected school board is what they want, but it's a long way from reality.
Right. So are there any other things you want to mention about that connection between the educational history we're talking about and the battles for the future of education going on today?
Well, I think one of the things that is troubling about the corporations taking over education, and I think we saw this with Enron, really what's good for GM is not necessarily good for the people, even when it starts to be couched in terms that seem as though the schools would be fulfilling their historic role, that the schools are preparing people for work, that the schools are preparing people to live as engaged citizens. But they are not. In point of fact, this model of education is one that at best produces technocrats, people who can read instructions but are not capable of figuring out what the ramifications of those instructions are. Even when corporations say they want people to think critically, it does not mean that they want people to think about things critically in relationship to the existing relationships of domination and subordination in society. They simply want people to know whether or not the directions for what they're supposed to be putting together works. And that is not the same as critical thinking. It seems as though that this model of education will ultimately do away with the ability to do critical thinking and with the ability to do creative thinking. And we will be right where it was predicted in the 1950s as a nation of sheep.
Wow, very nicely said. What makes you most concerned about the future of education, and what makes you most hopeful?
Well, what makes me the most concerned is the inability of people to think for themselves, the inability of people to think outside the box, the commitment that many people have to following directions. And the thing that is the most hopeful is that the 1960s followed the 1950s. And I am always hopeful that even the most conservative periods in our history can be followed by the enthusiasm, the creativity of the 1960s and the demand for change. And I do see young people doing some wonderful things. Sometimes, they make false starts. They don't quite get where they want to go, but at least there are some young people that are out there doing wonderful things.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered today?
Don't think so.
Okay. So our guest today has been Dr. Fanny Rushing. She currently is a history professor at Benedictine University in Lisle, Illinois. She was formerly field secretary for SNCC and a teacher in the Freedom Schools during the 1960s. Dr. Fanny Rushing, thank you so much for sharing your just incredible wealth of insight, wisdom, and inspiration with us today.
Thank you very much.